I'm going to give a sort of overview of the implications for women in the autumn statement. And I'm going to start with a bit of an overview from what the Office for Budget Responsibility said, because Jeremy Hunt very much presented this as a sort of a good news statement. Lots of positive things, inflation down, we've got more headroom, we can afford tax cuts and so on. Actually, if you read the OBR report, it's nowhere near as positive as Jeremy Hunt presented it. So the first thing to look at, can you see these slides as they're changing? Or are you still on my first slide?
We can see them.
Brilliant, that's great. So let's put that onto that. So the first thing to highlight is that the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, is predicting that inflation will remain higher for a longer period. Well, this is not the right slide. I'm really, really sorry. I'm just going to start this again and go back to the beginning. Right, okay. How's that? Is that right? Okay, sorry, technical problems there. I'll start again. So the first thing that the OBR said was that inflation was likely to remain higher for longer. So inflation reached a 40-year high in October last year, over 11%. In March, which is the red line, the OBR forecast that inflation would fall quite quickly. They're now forecasting a slower fall of inflation, meaning that we're not forecast to hit the 2% target till 2025. And that matters for a number of reasons. First of all, because that means we're going to continue to have high interest rates. It also means that people are going to be continuing to struggle with the cost of living. But high inflation has also given the Chancellor extra money. There's been more money taken in taxes, which has enabled him, according to his own fiscal rules, and it's important to remember that these are self-imposed fiscal rules, to have this bit of headroom that he has largely chosen to use to cut taxes. So the second thing that's important to recognise is that the Consumer Prices Index measure of inflation, which is the main one that the government is going on, the main one that the OBR is reporting on, is lower than the level of household costs that most people are having to meet. So the Office for National Statistics has another measure, which is the Household Costs Index, HCI, as opposed to CPI, which takes into account, it's not a kind of average basket of goods, it's the goods that people are actually spending money on. And it also includes things like debt repayment, childcare costs, and other things. And what we can see from this graph is that the Household Costs Index is actually higher and set to remain higher than the Consumer Prices Index. So at the moment, the household costs measure is at 8.2% higher than last year, compared to the 4.6% for CPI inflation. And that's important when you think about rising benefit levels, because those are the costs that most people are having to meet. And there's a much bigger gap to make up for. As I said, higher inflation means that means that interest rates are forecast to remain higher for longer. And again, the red line shows the forecast in March, and the black line shows the forecast at the autumn statement. And you can see from that black line that the Office of Budget Responsibility is forecasting that interest rates will remain higher. And that means higher mortgage payments for those people who have mortgages, and also passed on in higher rents to those people in the rented sector. And it's not just people who are renting from people who have mortgages. One of the things we see is that as rents go up, because mortgage owners feel they have to put up rents because of increased mortgages, even people who don't have mortgages, so who own houses outright, are putting up rents if they're renting their houses out, because they think they can, because the market will allow them to do it. So you're getting higher rents, and also higher cost of servicing debt, which is a problem for the government, but it's also a problem for women. Women are more likely to be in debt to meet day-to-day spending requirements. The other thing that came out from the OBR statement was really negative position on living standards. Our real disposable household income is lower than it was before the pandemic. It's set to be lower next year, and it's not going to return to pre-pandemic levels for several years. So we are all poorer than we were at the beginning of 2020. And I think it's important to put that sort of living standards point in the context of absolute poverty. We've seen from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation research on destitution that we've had really spiraling levels of destitution in the last few years. So 3.8 million people in destitution. This is a much more severe measure than poverty, which is relative, that including 1 million children. And the numbers of lone parents has increased really dramatically since 2019. I think it's also worth flagging that one of the reasons for that is that a lot of people are basically in negative budgets. So Citizens Advice give debt advice to people, and most of the time they look at their fixed spending, what they absolutely have to spend, and their incomes. And prior to COVID, they found that people had a surplus of about £20 a month if they cut back on every non-essential spending. Now the people they're advising on average have a £20 a month deficit. So there is nothing to squeeze. There is nothing left to cut. These people will go into further and further debt. So that's the sort of context in which the autumn statement took place. As I said, high inflation means that the OBR has forecast the economy will grow more quickly, increasing projected incomes from taxes. And that will increase faster than the forecast increase in spending on debt interest and benefits and so on. And so that gave the Chancellor more headroom. And he could have done a number of things with that. He could have paid down debt, he could have increased public spending, or he could have cut taxes. And he largely chose to cut taxes, with large public spending cuts projected for the next few years. What it's important to remember when thinking about this autumn statement is decisions that were made last year and were announced last year are still sort of built in to the government's planning. So the autumn budget included real terms cuts for unprotected departments. Those are all those departments other than health, schools, the Ministry of Defence, and overseas development. Everything else, for example, local government, prisons, transport, are all forecast to have real terms cuts. And that was bad enough in 2022. Now it's even worse. So inflation reduces the real terms value of the settlement that was made in 2022. And public services are facing a real terms cut of over £19 billion by 2027, 2028. And that's to perform at the level they are now. And we already know, the Institute for Government has reported that most public services are performing worse than they were before the pandemic and worse than they were in 2010. So even to keep them performing at this bad level will take £19 billion, let alone to improve things. So it's in that context that we need to see the Chancellor's decisions to cut taxes. But before we talk about that, I want to talk a little bit about social security. So there's some, not bad news. The government decided to increase social security in line with September's CPI rate, 6.7%, rather than the rate in October, which was 4.6%, had been rumoured. That is a good thing. But as we've seen from the ONS figures that were published earlier this week, there is still a gap between the real inflation rate that households are facing and the CPI rate. They also re-linked local housing allowance with actual rents, but only for a year. So when it was announced in the speech, we were all like, yeah, that's great, that's fabulous. And then you read the small print and it's actually been taken away again. And the benefit cap means that many of the poorest families won't see the full impact of the increase in local housing allowance. They maintained the pension triple lock, which is very important for tackling pensioner poverty, but they also increased benefit conditionality with lots of tough talk about, forcing people back to work and stopping people's benefits if they're not working. And there are also changes to the work capability assessment, which will reduce the number of sick and disabled people entitled to support. And it's worth noting that the Office of Budget Responsibility estimates that about 370,000 people will lose support as a result of that, but their estimate on increased employment is only about 10,000 people. So that's a huge amount of suffering for very, very little gain. One of the biggest announcements, certainly the one that got the most attention, I think, was the cut to national insurance contribution. So cut for employees by 2 points. We did an analysis by gendered household type, which showed that lone mothers would gain the least from this cut. So lone mothers only stand to gain £76 a year, lone fathers £248 a year, couples with children £437 a year. So that's, that is a tax cut that disproportionately benefits men and disproportionately disadvantages lone mothers, who are among the people hit hardest by the cost of living crisis. The other thing I wanted to flag up was on early education and childcare, because as you know, we host the Early Education and Childcare Coalition. There was significant investment announced in the spring budget, but it's very, very clear now that this is insufficient to cover the costs of expanding entitlement. And there's been no additional funding announced to cover the increase in the national living wage, which, although welcome, will put huge pressure on providers. And we know that the sector is already facing a recruitment crisis. So to sum up, this was presented as a good news budget with falling inflation and money for tax cuts, but the OBR report was far more negative than the Chancellor. We're going to be seeing real terms cuts to public spending in most departments, a funding gap of £19 billion by 2027-28, and we saw tax cuts that benefited more men than women. And underfunding public services hit women hardest. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary-Ann. We're now going to go to Carmen Martinez from Scottish Women's Budget Group. I'm just going to share Carmen's slides.
Thank you, Erin. Okay, so my presentation will focus on the impact of the Autumn Statement in Scotland, and will include what the Scottish Women's Budget Group would like to see as part of the Scottish budget. Next slide, please, Erin. So in terms of the structure of this presentation, we will first look at the situation of Scottish finances prior to the Autumn Statement. Next, we will look at the impact of the UK budget and current context. Then we will touch on the challenges for women and gender equality as a result. We'll discuss some taxation myths. And finally, we will look at what the Scottish Women's Budget Group would like to see in the Scottish budget before providing some final remarks. Next slide, please. So the Scottish Government published its medium-term financial strategy in May, and their modelling indicated that Scotland's resource spending requirements could exceed the government's central funding projections by 2%, or £1 billion, in 2024-25, rising to 4% in 2027-28. The longer-term funding position isn't less challenging. The Scottish Fiscal Commission warns that the Scottish Government spending over the next 50 years is projected to exceed the estimated funding available by an average of 1.7% each year, or 1.5 billion in today's prices, under current Scottish and UK government fiscal policies. And Scotland's population is projected to continue to grow older, with potential implications for the future demand of public services, as well as government spending and tax revenues. So as a result of these data, the parliamentary committees have focused on Scottish finances in the last few months. For example, the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee raised issues such as how the Scottish Government expects that health boards will be able to demonstrate their ability to break even by 2025-26 in a letter sent to the Health Minister at the end of October. And most importantly, the Finance and Public Administration Committee published a report titled The Sustainability of Scotland's Finances. And in this report, they make it very clear that there are difficult decisions lying ahead in relation to how the Scottish Government approaches taxation, the prioritization of spending, and also the reform of public services. The report also draws attention to other issues, such as the need to reform council tax, but raises the alarm about the potential implications of rising income tax due to potential behavioral impacts. And given the long-term challenges, the committee also recommends that the Scottish Government produces a full response to the Scottish Fiscal Commission's report, setting out the actions that the government will take to address the longer-term challenges. And meanwhile, the day before the UK budget was published, the Deputy First Minister announced additional in-year, so for this financial year, savings to fund emerging priorities in the current financial year. These total 680 million, reallocated or reprofiled from other budget areas, including the Scottish Funding Council, the agricultural support, and mental health spending. So the Scottish Parliament's Centre for Information published that a letter to the Finance and Public Administration Committee was sent by the Deputy First Minister, setting out the budget lines where these savings will be made, but precise allocations were not presented, although the letter states that the savings will fund things like public sector pay deals, the Scottish Child Payment, and the Fuel Insecurity Fund, and inflationary pressures within the health and social care budget. And then, according to analysis by the Fraser of Allender Institute, of the 680 million savings, about half of them are reductions, so these I'm talking about, and only 355 million are genuine reductions in pressures, perhaps even less. And of those 355, 157 is additional funding from the UK government. So while these might help the Deputy First Minister to comply with the spending limits this year, it kind of like stores up problems for the future, and will make the gap greater and therefore worse. But despite all this, in October, the First Minister announced the freeze of council tax rates, which means that the Scottish Government will have to come up with this money too, again, putting pressure on this funding gap. Next slide, please. So what is the situation now after the UK budget? So, well, given the fact that some matters are reserved, the increase in social security payments and the local housing allowance apply in Scotland too. Regarding tax measures, these also apply to Scotland. And again, according to analysis by the Fraser of Allender Institute, business investment in Scotland is below the UK average, and one of the drivers of Scotland's lower productivity, below the UK average. So the announcement is good news for those planning long-term investments, and could have a significant positive impact in Scotland if it leads to more productivity. Yet for women, the Chancellor made the apparent increases in their income disappear as he maintained the freeze on the thresholds for tax and national insurance bands. And according to the OBR, such freeze will see 4 million more people pay basic income and 3 million more move to the highest rates. In addition, despite continuing higher rates of inflation, the Chancellor failed to maintain the 900 cost of living payment that many low-income households have been receiving. And also, cutting national insurance contributions will generate no direct consequentials, and the lack of investment in public services will not generate large consequentials either. So we only get for the NHS this year, and then business rates this next year. So in Shona Robinson's words, the autumn statement is the worst case scenario for Scotland's finances. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges for women and gender equality as a result? So in addition to what has been said about the impact of the changes on national insurance contributions, and particularly single mothers, failure to invest in public services will also have consequences for women. During his speech, the Chancellor quoted Nigel Lawson and said that borrowing is just a fair tax on future generations, and we believe that the failure to invest in public services or tackling climate change is likely to mean that women and girls will also feel the pain, the economic pain in the near future as a result of needing to shore up already crumbling social infrastructure such as care and childcare. We also believe that the prioritization of tax cuts, which will benefit the wealthiest more, over investment in public services, will impact on Chancellor's stated intentions to grow the economy. This is because without addressing care and the level of unpaid care that women do, economic growth will be hampered. Next slide, please. Very quickly, we've been talking here at the Scottish Women's Budget Group about some myths that will need to be busted, because the Chancellor's statement was based on the premise that the UK is a high taxed nation, but while tax levels are at historically high levels, the UK is not a high tax country, but other nations' standards. We wrote that as part of our reaction to the UK statement, that the illusion that we can provide good quality public services with low taxation needs to be shattered, because lowering taxation is not the only way to grow the economy and improve individuals' standards of living. Public services such as the NHS, childcare, high quality education, etc., can improve people's living standards, particularly women's, contributing to greater gender equality and much needed economic activity. However, as everything, there needs to be gender analysis of tax policy, and I dare to say more accountability and transparency when it comes to public spending. Next slide, please. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not gonna go much into detail. But what we would like to see in the Scottish budget is, well, within the current context of the cost of living crisis, we obviously want to see a focus on social infrastructure, particularly adult social care and childcare. We want to see a focus on social security to provide this safety net for people who need it. And we want to see a fair deal for local authorities. In relation to social infrastructure, well, women's organizations have made a case for the care economy and the potential that this has for the societal benefits that come from investing in this. We've done some work here in Scotland as well as in relation to how this social infrastructure should look like or could look like. And we published a briefing about a transformative universal adult social care support service in Scotland. And we're also currently doing some work on childcare to kind of like keep it at the top of the policy agenda. Because the cost of childcare at the moment is becoming a great pressure for families, particularly women, and we think that extending the funded offer will help families and women particularly. Regarding social security, we recognize as well the importance that this has to complement women's incomes, and we will recommend that the Scottish Government increases the level of social security payments by at least September CPI figure, mitigates the 2-child limit and young parent penalty through additional payments of the Scottish Child Payment, and increases funding for the Scottish Welfare Fund. And finally, regarding local authorities, this year cost analysis of the last year's budget indicates that there has been only a 71 million cash increase once all national level government commitments are covered, and with high inflation rates and increased costs of energy and fuel, increasing demand on services and higher than anticipated pay rises, this level of cash increase means that most local authorities are still struggling to cover costs and have sought to make savings, i.e. cuts on services. But we argue that these services are vital for women, and some of them provide the social infrastructure that I was talking about. Therefore, we need to see a fair deal, a fair approach to local budgets with financial settlements that allow for the continuation of key public services for women while guaranteeing fair pay for local government workers. Next slide, please. So just to finish, the economic environment is very challenging in Scotland. However, decisions are still very important. In October, the First Minister announced a freeze on council tax rates for the next financial year, which could be the Scottish version of tax giveaways. And we know, because everyone is talking about it as well, that difficult decisions lie ahead, and there are talks of public sector reform. However, we would argue that other revenues need to be explored, other revenue avenues need to be explored. The maximization of available resources in line with human rights approaches is also there, and of course, gender analysis of any other policy decisions, including public sector reform. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmen. Okay, we're going to go to Hannah Griffiths from the Wales Women's Budget Group.
Thanks, Erin. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you all see that? Okay. Is it full screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry. All right. So hi, everyone. I'm Hannah. I'm the coordinator of the Wales Women's Budget Group. And I'm going to chat today on the implications of the Autumn Statement for women in Wales. And a little bit about our priorities as the WWBG for the upcoming Welsh Government draft budget on the 19th of December. Before I get into that, I just wanted to give a brief overview of the current financial position of Welsh Government. So you might have seen back in August that the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, released a statement announcing a 900 million real term shortfall in the current Welsh Government budget, the 23 to 24 budget, due to inflation and public sector pay rises. So over the summer recess, Cabinet Ministers were asked to mitigate those pressures by finding budgetary cuts and reprioritisations in their departments. So the resultant in-year spending changes were then published in October, which detailed around over £600 million worth of budget reprioritisations and cuts across all departments apart from health and transport. So as you can see, an additional 425 million was allocated to the Welsh NHS and an additional 125 million to Transport for Wales, which provides rail services in Wales. So while that additional funding to vital public services is welcome, it's nowhere near enough to plug the funding gaps that providers are facing in Wales. Local health boards, for example, are facing an 800 million shortfall within the next year. So that additional 425 million isn't even enough to allow those services to stand still as they are, and will inevitably result in cuts to service provision. In addition to those reprioritisations, there were a few spending cuts announced that are quite concerning from a gendered perspective. So, for example, the Welsh Government's early years childcare and play funding was reduced down by 16.1 million. And that was able to be reprioritised, apparently due to updated forecasts on the uptake of the Welsh Government's childcare offer, which provides 30 hours of funded childcare provision to parents of 3 to 4-year-olds in Wales. But that reduction in funding seems a bit nonsensical to us because we know, there's ample evidence and research at the minute that shows that the need for affordable and accessible childcare in Wales is a pressing issue and as pressing as ever. We know that in the current cost of living crisis, high childcare costs are compounding the financial pressures faced by low-income households in Wales, and pushing parents, particularly single mothers, into debt and poverty. So we obviously don't know the full impact of those cuts at the minute, but they're also probably problematised by the announced increase in the national living wage as well in the autumn statement. So we urgently need more clarification on the impacts of those. Another concerning cut concerns the Welsh Government's social justice budget, which was revised down by 7 million. But on closer inspection, we find that the majority of those savings are coming from the Welsh Government's Equality, Inclusion and Human Rights budget, which actually only makes up 13% of the overall social justice budget. So it's quite disproportionate. And the cuts to that area are concerning because it funds a number of social justice initiatives and programmes and a couple of third sector organisations and women's organisations in Wales. So disproportionate cuts to that budget in the wider context of huge funding challenges in the third sector in Wales is really quite problematic. And finally, while funding for the Welsh Government's local authorities was protected in these in-year spending cuts, local authorities in Wales, which we know provide the vital services that women use and need, such as social care, childcare, housing, are facing a funding gap of 354 million in the next year in Wales. So going into the autumn statement, Wales's public finances were already in quite a challenging position. Even with reprioritised funding, public services here are crumbling under unprecedented funding gaps, which will lead and have led to cuts in service provision. As we've heard, these cuts impact women who are more likely to use public services and more likely to work within them. So really what we wanted to see in the autumn statement was large-scale investment in public services, the consequential funding of which could be used to plug those gaps in Wales. That's obviously not what we got in the autumn statement. So from a Welsh perspective, what did we get? We received our block grant, which amounts to about 18 billion, a figure that was set back in 2021 in the spending review. And in addition to that, we received 305 million in Barnett consequential funding from spending decisions in devolved areas. That might look like quite a lot, but it actually amounts to a real terms cut in the settlement of about 1%. And means that our settlement for, well, the Welsh Government settlement for 2024 to 25 is worth up to 1.3 billion pounds less in real terms from what was set in 2021. Moving on then to the actual policy announcements in the autumn statement. The centrepiece of the Chancellor's statement was arguably his cuts to national insurance, for example, the 2% cut to employee contributions. According to the Welsh Secretary, David T.C. Davies, this will amount to an average annual tax cut of £324 for 1.2 million workers in Wales. However, as we've heard, tax cuts disproportionately benefit men more so than women. This is because women typically earn less than men and so are less likely to be paying those contributions or will be paying less in them. The Chancellor's cuts to self-employed contributions will also disproportionately benefit men in Wales, seeing as the number of self-employed men in Wales is almost double that of self-employed women. However, probably the most detrimental impact or consequence of those tax cuts in Wales is that they remove a crucial source of revenue for vital public services. As I've said, this is disheartening in a Welsh context where health boards, local authorities and other public service providers are facing unprecedented funding gaps and cuts to provision. And from a gendered perspective, women are more likely to rely on these public services and to be employed in them. So the autumn statement's disregard for public services in favour of gender unequal tax cuts will disproportionately and negatively impact women in Wales and throughout the UK. Moving on then to social security. As we know, due to persistent gender inequality, women across the UK occupy an unequal position in the economy, by which they're more likely either to be economically inactive or to be working in part-time, lower paid roles. That means that women tend to have lower wealth and savings overall, meaning that they're, particularly women who face additional intersecting disadvantage, are being hit hardest by the rising costs and the current cost of living crisis. In Wales, that's translated to an increased reliance amongst women on the UK social security system, which, unlike the other devolved nations, is completely reserved in Wales. So in this context, we welcome the Chancellor's decision to uprate benefits in line with September's as opposed to October's CPI figure, which would have resulted in a real terms cut. We were extremely concerned, however, with the further expansion of conditionality and sanctions announced in the autumn statement. You'll remember that back in March, in the spring budget, the Chancellor expanded conditionality and sanctions to in-work claimants under universal credit, non-working partners and lead carers of 1 to 2 year olds. And we found that each of those reforms disproportionately impact women claimants, and the latter actually hits women in Wales hardest because there's no funded provision and no plans to extend funded provision to under 2 year olds here. But the further expansion of conditionality due to changes in the work capability assessment and the government's new Back to Work plan will result in many more people with health conditions and disabilities losing significant income and becoming subject to intensified conditionality requirements and punitive sanctions. Sanctions are not only proven to be ineffective at moving claimants off benefits and into long-term sustainable employment, but they're also welfare worsening. They cause a lot of undue stress, which is likely to exacerbate existing illnesses and conditions, which will then just put more pressure on an already struggling NHS. So from our perspective, that was clearly a misguided approach, which could probably be said for a lot of the decisions in the autumn statement. And in terms of Welsh Government's upcoming draft budget, it didn't really provide them with a lot of wiggle room to fund the struggling public services that we have here. But in light of the implications of the autumn statement, and just to finish up from me, in terms of what we want to see in the upcoming draft budget from the Welsh Government, we would like to see some clarity on the Welsh Government's in-year spending changes, particularly with regards to the cuts to their childcare budget, the demand for which we know remains high, and the costs of which are likely to increase following the increase in the national living wage. We need to see investment in the vital public services that women use and need, and the local authorities that provide them, which, despite reprioritised funding, are still facing significant funding gaps and cuts to provision. We want to see urgent action to protect the sustainability of the women's sector and wider third sector in Wales, which plays a crucial role in scrutinising spending and policy decisions and supporting the least advantaged in our society, and which in Wales appears to be rapidly contracting. And finally, we want to see progress on the Welsh Government's gender budgeting commitments and pilots. So we currently have 3 gender budgeting pilots in Wales, the first of which, personal learning accounts, has now ended. And after a long delay, we finally received its external evaluation, which made for a grim reading. It basically highlighted a number of issues that problematized the implementation of a gender budgeting approach. So things like timing, high staff turnover in Welsh Government, which led to lack of expertise, a lack of training for providers. And those issues basically just led to the complete deprioritisation of the gender budgeting approach within the pilot. So we need to see those issues addressed and resolved, and the learnings implemented within the other gender budgeting pilots to ensure that the same thing doesn't happen within them, and to ensure that we can learn how gender budgeting can affect spending and policy decisions within those pilots, with the view to rolling out gender budgeting across Welsh Government in the future. That's all from me. I think I'm going to pass over to Erin and then Alex. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, so moving swiftly to Alex Brennan, who's going to give an overview from the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group.
Yep, so I'll just share my screen here. Right from beginning. Can everyone see that? Oh, maybe.
Yeah.
Yep, okay. So yes, I'm Alexandra Brennan. I'm the coordinator of the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group. Sorry, I just don't know if it's, yep, there we go. And unlike maybe the other 3 presentations you've seen, our context is slightly different just because of the current, political situation that we are in at the minute. So our current sort of fiscal context is that we've had a collapse of government. We haven't had any sort of executive government since February or March 2021 or 2022, and we haven't had caretaker ministers since October 2022. So effectively, we haven't had any sort of political representatives in office for over a year, and we've had no government or no real governments over nearly 2 years from now. So that's obviously made things very constrained, and this led to quite a large budget overspend in the previous budget, and in the current budget we are also heading towards an overspend, as while the budget was being drafted in February and March 2022, it never actually was approved by the executive, so it never went ahead. We didn't get a budget until November 2022 that was implemented by the Secretary of State, and therefore ministers were making decisions and civil servants were making decisions really without any sort of overall guidance on what they should be doing, and that led to an over £3 million overspend, which then the Secretary of State has said that we will repay. So that has led to our current budget that was implemented in May 2023 by the Secretary of State, that saw 10 to 20% cuts per department in Northern Ireland. And the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child called for this budget to be scrapped based off its impact on children and wider impact on equality, because of its negative impact. And it's compounded on multiple crises in Northern Ireland as a society emerging from conflict. We have obviously physical health crisis. Infrastructure is not the way it is in the rest of the UK. We have a mental health crisis that can be linked to the conflict. We have obviously fiscal and political crises that stemmed from this current collapse of government, but also the previous collapses of government. And despite all of this, the Secretary of State, Chris Heaton-Harris, has made the decision to send all in-year funding back to Treasury to pay back the previous year's overspend of £3 million. And according to the Permanent Secretary of our Department of Finance, we are also heading towards another overspend of about £4 million, I believe, this year, or we are heading towards an overspend at least, is what they're predicting for this budget year as well. And that the Fiscal Council, stated that the reason that we had the overspend in the first place was a combination of the inflationary pressures from the previous, from the cost of living crisis, and a lack of spending direction after the collapse of government. So in the autumn statement, there's £75 million that were meant to go to public services in Northern Ireland that will be returned to Treasury to help pay off the overspend. That is also currently unknown what will become of the extra £110 million that's supposed to come in the new year, but because of the Secretary of State's commitment to returning any in-year funding to Treasury, it's unlikely that that will also go to public services in Northern Ireland. So a place where we have some of the we're a low-wage economy and one of the poorest performing economies in the UK, and our public services need the funding. It's not being received because of that overspend. What was announced within the autumn statement was £3 million to tackling paramilitarism, which is a program here in Northern Ireland. And it is quite counterproductive when you look at the austerity measures that are implemented by this government, because especially over the previous decade, because universal credit has been described as a driver for paramilitary activity, for illegal lending, and 6% of women who utilize illegal lending in Northern Ireland do so through paramilitary organizations. And we do know that poverty increases paramilitary organizations' holds on particular communities in Northern Ireland. So while they're spending £3 million on tackling paramilitarism, it's likely that their austerity measures will actually increase and drive paramilitary activity in Northern Ireland, and it's quite counterproductive spend. And this will have particular impact on women, as women are more likely to use paramilitaries for loan sharks, or for debt reasons. And again, their austerity measures will drive women into debt. And this is money that would be wasted on other policies to ensure that poverty is eradicated, which would therefore eradicate the need for paramilitaries in those areas in terms of debt. But besides these points, we echo what the other women's budget groups have said in their presentations, particularly around the decreases to national insurance and the Back to Work plan, and how these are incredibly gendered policy decisions, particularly the Back to Work plan, as Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK that doesn't have any publicly funded childcare. So while we've had conversations with our Department for Communities here around the conditionality and how that may impact women particularly different in Northern Ireland, because they can't increase childcare, there's no publicly funded childcare, and they advise that they're advising the work coaches to take discretion on these matters, and if there are women that have caring responsibilities, to maybe go a bit easy on them. Obviously, that's not going to impact, or that's not going to get to every single work coach and every single woman who may be forced into up to 30 hours of searching for work while they're utilizing benefits. So in this context, we don't really know what to expect in our upcoming budget. It's likely, sorry to stay on this slide, but it's likely that anything that's not statutory that hasn't already been cut is on the line. And that's something as simple as nursery services, as a lot of public services were defunded or cut in the previous budget. So I think what I want to do within this presentation is describe what we would like to see, even though it's not necessarily what we want to see in the budget. It's the more structural changes that we want to see that may alleviate the financial pressure on Northern Ireland and may help give a bit of guidance to the civil servants that are currently essentially making the decisions in our government. So the first is we're advocating for a funding floor in Northern Ireland, similar to the needs-based funding floor in Wales. And this was implemented in Wales in the 2018-2019 fiscal year to prevent further gap in public service delivery. And Northern Ireland's needs are significant because we're one of the lowest contributors to revenue per head in the UK, and it's the highest per capita spend at £118 identical expenditure on services per head. But this spend used to be greater before the pandemic at £121 per head. but Northern Ireland is the only nation to not have returned to or increased its pre-pandemic services per head spend, even though we have been significantly impacted by the pandemic and by austerity and cost of living that stemmed after the pandemic. And this also aligns with the Holtham report that noted that Northern Ireland would need or require about £121 departmental expenditure limit spend per head. And then, while I know the measurement of identifiable expenditure on services per head and DEL per head is slightly different, it still shows that there is a clear defunding of Northern Ireland, and we're heading towards that Barnett squeeze already, which the Fiscal Council of Northern Ireland estimated that we would hit that squeeze by 2030, but it's looking like we're hitting that squeeze a bit sooner. So we are a low wage economy with the highest rate of economic inactivity across the 4 nations. We have the highest uptake of universal credit and equivalent legacy benefits in the UK, and more people cutting back on essentials than anywhere else in the UK. And while spend may seem quite high relative to England and other developed nations, it is because the need in Northern Ireland warrants it. And we suggest that to prevent the future of chronic underfunding, we demand that the UK government puts a needs-based funding floor in place in Northern Ireland. And we understand that this will not protect us from a financial constraint during times of economic crisis, but it will ensure that the funding needed to maintain public services is delivered through the block grant, and that the Barnett formula was never really meant to be a permanent fixture to determine devolved spending. And if reforms can be made to rightly protect Wales, then we're hoping that those same protections can be put in place in Northern Ireland to protect us from underfunding. We are also calling for program for government. So for the past 2 financial years, departments in Northern Ireland have been making decisions without ministers, an executive, and without a program for government. So the last program for government, which was only a draft document that was taken on by senior civil service, provided departments, at least in an absence of government, with a framework for some overall policy direction during a time with no government. But without a program for government, we've seen departmental overspends, as I mentioned before, and a general lack of direction of resources. And budgeting without a guiding document like a program for government is bad practice, as the budget needs to be informed by policy objectives and not the other way around, which is unfortunately, the budget informing what our program for government or the program for government outcomes in 2021, which was only a draft document, has been practice here. So the program for government also provides transparency for the public and allows for proper scrutiny, and these crucial aspects of good budgeting have been absent in our budgeting process, especially in the most recent budget set by the Secretary of State, that without the program for government, there's no mechanism for public engagement, and we were only able to consult on the equality impact assessments and equality screenings, which did not provide much scope for influencing policies so much as mitigating the worst of the impacts. So while it won't be possible to sign off on an official program for government without an executive in place, a draft governance document to guide the direction of the next financial year's spend with the input of public consultation is necessary to allow for good budgeting practices. And finally, we're advocating for spending to save. So I've put a couple examples up around what we're suggesting could make quite transformative differences, even though they are quite small decisions, seemingly, that if our departments actually did spend money or invest now, we could save ourselves from future financial crises or worsen the impacts of future financial crises, as the 10 to 20% cuts at the minute will undoubtedly lead to a decimation of public services in Northern Ireland, and will undoubtedly lead us to further financial trouble. And I want to pick out one of the examples of the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy under the Executive Office. To resource it, as violence against women and girls in Northern Ireland currently costs the government £750 million annually, because Northern Ireland is one of the, if it's not it's the second most dangerous place for women in Europe, and it has one of the highest rates of femicide in Europe. So for example, even investing in a strategy like the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which every other nation in the UK has some sort of commissioner or strategy around this, we're the only place that doesn't, could actually not only make a difference in the safety and the impact of violence against women and girls that is already currently felt here, but it also could save the government a significant amount of money. For the Department for Infrastructure, the decisions that are currently being made, or the proposals that are currently being put out by the department, is to end the treatment of sewage in Northern Ireland, which will see a decrease from 99.23% compliant with wastewater treatment works to just 25% compliant. So we're seeing really, again, like I said, a decimation of public services. And if we had a direction for ministers or for, senior public servants to spend to save at the minute, we could really avoid possibly a decimation again of public services in Northern Ireland. So thank you.